أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. How are you, my friends? As we all know, the war between Israel and Hamas has drawn so many international reactions. It's no longer the issue of Muslims anymore. Everyone
That's
in the world
absolutely
is
correct.
condemning the actions of Israel, the Israeli government, the Israeli soldiers, and the Israeli settlers in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. And we all know that about more than 20,000 people have been killed
Yes,
in this
actually, it's
barbaric
over
war.
22. It's over 22,000 now. It's over 22,000.
Yes, unfortunately, these figures don't seem to stop. These figures the number is just increasing day by day, and it's a very unfortunate situation. And to analyze this issue, we have invited a very special guest today. His name is Mr. John Koffis. So,
Yes.
how are you, Mr. Koffis?
I'm very well. Thank you very much, Assad, for inviting me. And this is a very important subject, not, as you pointed out, not just for the Israelis and the Palestinians, not just for Muslims, but for the entire world. And the reaction that we have seen globally, including in the Western countries, on the part of grassroots movements, in other words, mass demonstrations in major cities, including in the United States, that illustrates how significant this is.
So, well, I will start the conversation. And before that, I want to ask a very important question.
Yes, go ahead.
What is your understanding of Zionism?
Well,
I mean,
Zionism,
what do you feel is Zionism, and what is the agenda, and what are their goals?
yeah, Zionism, the ideological origins of it go back to 1896. Theodor Herzl was the ideological father of the Zionist movement. The that is political Zionism. I want to make sure that we're very clear on this. Political Zionism. Now, the fact is that in the 1890s, in the mid 1890s, when the movement began, because a year after Theodor Herzl wrote the book which started the movement a year later, there were a lot of very important developments in Europe. This was a period of European colonialism intensifying. The Europeans themselves were fighting over colonies and spheres of influence. One of the most important conflicts of this nature that exploded was in South Africa, called the Boer War in the late 90s, and it dragged on until 1902. And this was a prelude to World War I. And in fact, a British intellectual, John Hobson, wrote about this, that war would explode into a major war. So the background of Zionism was really European imperialism. Zionists came primarily from Eastern Europe, some from Western Europe. They came together to create this idea of a Jewish state that would be, I don't want to say a theocratic society, but a political entity for Jews, who, by the way, in all fairness, the fact is, since the Black Death in the 14th century, Jews were discriminated systematically throughout Europe. So there was, in fact, good reason for having a homeland. The absence of a homeland, they felt, was what brought about the persecution. They didn't have anywhere to go. Um, However, this blossomed against the background of colonialism, European colonialism. So the early political Zionists were influenced by European colonialism, by imperialism, and a very important ideology, which to this day has an impact on modern day Zionists, and that is social Darwinism, which is a racist ideology about the superiority of one group of people versus another. And social Darwinism also has aspects of influences, rather, in Zionism. Um, the Zionist movement begins in 1920 in earnest, and in the 1920s, Albert Einstein warned in a number of correspondences to friends of his that this is a right wing movement, a dangerous ideology that picked up in the interwar period in the 1920s aspects of fascism. In the 1930s, Einstein again warned friends of his in his writings, that fascism was embedded into Zionism. So the fact is that the movement, it didn't come from another planet. It didn't come from out of nowhere. It came out of the European political context, out of colonialism, social Darwinism, nationalism, militarism, some of the worst aspects. Now, we have to understand, again, I reiterate this, this is very important, that Jews were discriminated against. And of course, the Holocaust is an illustration of the degree to which Jews were discriminated. But Zionists, in going to the mandate of Palestine that the British established in the Balfour Declaration in 1917. In other words, what was essentially Palestine, but it was a semi-colony of the British. They went there, and they were welcomed by the Palestinians. They were welcomed by the Arabs, by the Muslims. However, they were determined that this is the land in which they were going to establish a Zionist state, which is an exclusivist ideology. It excludes those who are not of that faith. And that is the origin. That's just a very brief, very brief history of it. And of course, they had their start. I mean, a lot of people are surprised that we see the violence in Gaza today. The fact is that Israel was born of war. In other words, the Zionists, who had a paramilitary organization called the Haganah, which in Hebrew means the defense. It was basically a terrorist group. There's no other way to describe it. They targeted individuals, they assassinated, they bombed places, targeting not just Arabs and Muslims and Palestinians, but actually the British. And so he was born out of this right-wing rebellion to establish a Zionist entity and to exclusively for, of course, a Jewish state, not to include Palestinians. And this is how it was, this is how Israel as a state began. Now, there was a UN proposal in 1947, I believe it was in September or October 1947, which was for actually a two-state solution, to take the mandate of Palestine and create two states, one Israel, one Palestinian. That never came to fruition. The Israeli rebels, guerrilla fighters, terrorists, whatever you want to call them, prevailed, and in 1948, of course, as everyone knows, created their own state. And in creating their own state, they marginalized the Palestinian population. And by marginalizing them, that is when you have the embryonic stage of what many scholars, including Jewish scholars to this day, call the apartheid state.
Okay, Mr. Kofas, well, uh, we can understand that how Zionists occupied Israel, the land of Palestine, and they created the state of Israel. Now, let's get to
We
the
can,
75-year-old issue between the
yes,
Israelis and Palestinians. And you know that it has all boiled down to that attack on October 7th when Hamas
yes,
attacked Israel.
yes.
So,
The October 7th attack, as the Secretary General of the United Nations pointed out, and of course the Israelis immediately condemned the United Nations Secretary for saying this. This did not come out of nowhere. There is a context here. Hamas did not come out of nowhere. Hamas was created in part because Israel, including Bibi Netanyahu, Benjamin Netanyahu, the prime minister right now, wanted Hamas to exist. And the reason is there's a twofold reason. Number one, they wanted to weaken the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank. Okay, that's one reason. And the second reason is to keep the Palestinians divided and weak and to avoid the two state solution. Netanyahu, on a number of occasions, has made it very clear that he's proud that he contributed to preventing the two state solution. There have been many reports, including by Israelis, by the way, who have that have illustrated bags of money were taken to the border to be delivered to Hamas. Israel, it's not this idea that, oh, it's Iran, it's Iran because Iran wants Hamas to cause troubles for the Israelis. The Israelis themselves, politically, for their own reasons, and wanted Hamas to exist, and they were financing Hamas. This doesn't mean that the only source of revenue was from the Israelis, but they contributed. If they didn't want Hamas, it wouldn't exist. Now, that's one issue. Let's take another one, which is, let's say Hamas never existed. Apartheid still did. Long before Hamas, there was apartheid. As you pointed out, 75 years of it. So the issue is not Hamas. Hamas is the pretext. And this is not, by the way, I'm not condoning because I'm against any form of random violence. I don't believe in random violence. I don't believe it, I'm, I was 30 years, I was in higher education. And when I taught Russian history and especially 19th century Russian history with anarchists in Russia, who, by the way, Russian anarchists use violence. This is one of the influences of Zionists. A number of Zionists were influenced by European anarchists who did use random violence as a weapon. I don't believe it's effective. I believe in grassroots organization, grassroots support. But the idea that Hamas, let's take this isolated group, Hamas is the focus of all evil, and if it just didn't exist, there would be no problem. Of course, there would be a problem. They had apartheid long before Hamas, for decades. Hamas never existed, and they still had apartheid. They still marginalized the entire population of Palestine. And they created, on top of that, they created Hamas to keep them, to keep the apartheid state, to keep that population, the minority population, which is, in numbers is about equal to the Israeli population, to keep them divided and weak, and to use them as a pretext to argue that we have the right to self-defense. How can a conqueror argue a right to self-defense? It's like, for example, the British in India, when they had this colony arguing, we have the right to self-defense. Mahatma Gandhi should not rise up, should not get the people all riled up against British colonialism because we have the right to self-defense. Self-defense to what? They were occupiers. So you have a colonialist mentality, self-defense within the context of that colonialist mindset. Yeah, self-defense within that context, which means you automatically marginalize that population. You know, in some respects, this is not that different from what was happening in South Africa before Nelson Mandela and the ANC, the African National Congress, when the white Afrikaners were arguing, well, they're terrorists. Mandela is a terrorist, you see. So we have the same thing here. You know, they demonize the people who are oppressed. The oppressor, we're just defending ourselves. But how can the oppressor be defending? The oppressor the logic is absurd. It's not rational to argue in this fashion.
Okay, Mr. Kofus, well, speaking of the terrorists, all that war that has occurred and the destruction that the Israeli military has caused in the Gaza Strip, uh, there have been opinions that Hamas has pushed Palestinians into this trouble. What do you say about that?
Yeah. Look. The fact is, the Palestinian people are no different than anyone else. It's not. This doesn't mean there aren't Palestinians who are not of many ideological views and political leanings. Obviously, the population is heterogeneous. In other words, in thought and in there are some who are to the left, some to the center, some to the right. So it's not that they are all of one entity. However, all Palestinians have one common denominator. They are the minority within a Zionist apartheid state. No one denies this. They may deny that it exists because that is those who support the state of Israel. They, there is no apartheid state, and I have heard this many times. There is no apartheid state. But then when you look at the daily lives of people in Gaza, for example, rationing utilities from water to electricity to medical supplies. You remember when COVID broke out? They had enough. I remember I don't remember if it was Pfizer or one of the big pharmaceutical companies, the multinational corporation, that had sent enough vaccines, and they wouldn't deliver them. They took a long time to. The people in Gaza were waiting. They wouldn't deliver this, and I remember the term back then. It's not that long ago, I guess 3 years ago. Um, they used the term vaccine apartheid. You know, they even when it came to public health issues, they applied apartheid. So I mean, the term apartheid may sound, oh yeah, you're just using it because it's a fancy, trendy term. It's not. When there is a pandemic like COVID and people's health is impacted, and you have the vaccines, and you're not giving them to them because they're Palestinians. What are we supposed? You can use any term you want. What are you supposed to call that? What do you call something like that? When you ration the water, when they bring cement trucks and they pour cement down the wells that the Palestinians use in the farm so they don't have access to the, what is that? Now they block them from having water in their farms. When you have settlers going into Palestine, and they, by the way, they freely admit this. This is in the age of modern technology, when people have a phone and they record everything. It's very difficult to hide the evidence because it's recorded. The settlers go in and take forcibly remove the family from its own house, and they're out in the street, and then they take over that house. What do you call it? What is that supposed to be called? What if Palestinians did that to Jewish families? I would have condemned it just as strongly as I condemn this, because I believe in universal human rights, which, by the way, is part of the United Nations Charter. This is not pro-Palestinian. This is not an issue of, oh, yes, you're pro-Palestinian. No, I'm not. I'm pro-human rights universally. It doesn't matter who it is. The question is, if you want human rights for yourself, why deny them to the other half of the population? Because there are approximately half of the population in Israel is made up of Palestinians. And when after, you pointed out, the October event, the October 7th event, Hamas, okay, well, Israeli government officials came out very clearly. They said, we are going to impose a siege. According to the United Nations, that's a violation of international law. A number of petitions have been filed with the ICC, okay, at The Hague, the International Court, at The Hague, against Israel for violating international law. South Africa just filed the latest, accusing them of apartheid. I would love to see South Africa's petition, how the court deals with the South African petition, considering where South Africa has been, its history, because if the court said, well, we're just not going to hear this case. However, when it comes to sub-Saharan African countries, they'll hear the case, or Eastern European countries like the Balkans, for example, some of the former Yugoslavian republics, where they brought people before the court, but not Israel. Why? Because the US is the sponsor behind it. And Europe, it's not just the US. Now, the US has its own reasons, and those two are historical, and they're geopolitical, and they're economic. They have a vested interest. They're concerned about counterbalancing Iran and Syria. Okay? Now, why are the Palestinian people paying the price? And by the way, let's look at the numbers. You mentioned the numbers. They're up to 22,000. About 2/3 of them are women and children. That's not war. War is when you have two conventional armies going at each other. That's war. Classic definition of war is conventional armies going at each other, like the Napoleonic Wars, World War I, World War II, the classic wars. This is not war. This is Israel with the aid of the West, especially the United States. They don't hide it. Nobody's trying to conceal anything here. Sending military aid, and what's on the receiving end? Palestinian civilians. That's not a conventional army. I don't know how anyone can argue this is war in the classic sense of the word war. This is not Napoleon Bonaparte going against the British Army and Navy. That's not what this is. This is the Israelis hitting targets that are civilian, including ambulances, hospitals, schools, UN staff, by the way, journalists. Over 90 journalists have been killed during this so-called war, which is not a war. It's a military campaign against Gazan civilians.
Okay, Mr. Kofus, well, you just mentioned the United Nations. Unfortunately, we have seen that since the UN has came into existence in after World War II, there have been so many wars, there have been so many mass murders, genocides, and atrocities against unarmed men, women, and children. And the same has been happening in Israel for the 75 years. They have been covertly attacking unarmed civilians. They do not have the courage to fight proper wars against armed warriors. So I just want to ask, uh, what is UN doing for the past 75 years? We have seen the Vietnam War, we have seen the so many wars in the Middle East, and we are seeing the war in Sudan, we are seeing the Russia and Ukraine war. So what is UN doing?
An excellent question. I have read a number of articles in the last couple of months on that from different parts of the world, from the Chinese perspective, the Russians. Sergei Lavrov has raised questions. A lot of people are raising questions. What is the UN doing? And it's a legitimate question. If the purpose of the UN is to solve conflict through diplomatic channels, to avoid the bloodshed, the sort of thing we're seeing in Gaza, where is the UN? It's a logical question. And there have been a lot of people who have used because right now we have the war that the military campaign that Israel is carrying out against the civilians in Gaza, against the background of another war, which is, by the way, a conventional war, and that is between Russia and Ukraine. That's a conventional war. So we have two wars simultaneously. And the UN, as you point out, is doing nothing, seemingly. Now, the Secretary General did go to Moscow, he did go to Kyiv, he did speak out, he has spoken out repeatedly. He wants an immediate ceasefire, he wants a diplomatic solution. It's his obligation. That's exactly what he should be doing, by the way. That's why he's there, that's his job. They should be doing this. When the UN was created, the UN, just a little bit of background, the UN is actually a continuation of the League of Nations. The League of Nations was created immediately after World War I, and it was an American idea. Woodrow Wilson, the president, during World War I, and some of his top advisors, including a guy who later became Secretary of State under FDR, under Franklin Roosevelt. His name was Cordell Hall from Tennessee, a Democrat from Tennessee, a very progressive individual. These people agreed that there must be an international organization that prevents wars like what happened in World War I between 1914 and 1918. It was a good idea, the Wilsonian internationalist view of the world with a global organization was a good idea. You know what happened immediately? As soon as they created the organization, immediately the great powers, as they were called, there were no superpowers in the interwar period, began alienating each other and isolating itself. Among them, the United States. The United States, which created the League of Nations, never joined it. Never joined the League of Nations. So the era in the 1920s here, under three successive Republican presidents, is called the era of isolationism. The US has isolated itself. So you have basically one ineffective organization that is succeeded by another, the United Nations. The United Nations is created now. FDR is in charge. Cordell Hall, who had been an advisor to Wilson, is now Secretary of State. They agreed, yes, we need a strong United Nations. They built that big building in New York, and they said, okay, this is going to be different. Now, once they put those 5 members on the Security Council with veto power, any one of those can veto anything. You have seen the United States veto the ceasefire proposals that the other members agreed. The UK, by the way, always siding with the United States, but at least he was willing to abstain. The US was the power that was not willing to go along with the Security Council. Then what did the Chinese and the Russians, but also the Arab League, they figured, okay, we'll bypass the Security Council. They go to the General Assembly, and the vote there was 153 votes against, I think, 40 or 42 who voted with the US and Israel. But 153 votes was the overwhelming majority of the world public opinion and world governments saying we want an end to this and a diplomatic solution, an end to bloodshed. Okay, now what happens next? Nothing. As you pointed out, what does the UN do? It's powerless unless the major countries behind the UN, and we know which countries they are, obviously the G7, Russia and China, as well as India, by the way, unless they, and India in this case is with Israel, but India was actually in the vote, in the General Assembly vote, it's surprised. I don't know what they have other issues again that are in conflict with the United States. So they actually voted against the US on this one. They voted with a majority, the 153. So you have a very weak United Nations, powerless. So your point is well taken. The United Nations is not functioning. Otherwise, we wouldn't have this mess. If it were functioning, they would immediately have the power of at least the most powerful countries. The US, by the way, is the largest military in the world, with military presence in most countries in the world. It spends 10 times more than the 10 countries combined in defense. So the US, if the US, with its all that muscle, objects, then the UN as an international organization can't do much. So the others have to figure out ways to work around the US. The US has to be on board. Both in Ukraine is the same thing, by the way. China put together a proposal almost a year ago. President Xi in Beijing put together a proposal to bring an end to the Ukraine conflict, the war with Russia. Russia has its own security issues. Ukraine, obviously, especially the western part of the Ukraine, is with the West, with the Europeans and the US. The Chinese at least put something on the table. They say, okay, this is a starting point. Let's discuss this. Let's involve the UN. Let's involve all the major parties. They sidelined. They paid lip service to it, and they sidelined it. Okay, there is something the UN could have gotten behind, but the Security Council members, obviously with exception of Russia and China, in the case of Ukraine, were not for it. So if that's the problem with international organizations, the governance structure is such that it precludes effective operation unless there is consensus. And it's very difficult to get consensus because the fact is the United States has a 75-year history of supporting Israel. There have been some presidents, some. Jimmy Carter, I was a graduate student. I remember Jimmy Carter tried very hard. He was as close to trying to look at the other side. And, as Edward Said, he's passed away. He used to work at Columbia University. He was a Palestinian historian. As Edward Said pointed out, all we want is to look at our side as well, not just one side. In this war, what the world has seen is this blind support for Israel with total disregard, and of what the Palestinian issues are. Oh, it's Hamas terrorism. Even if Hamas by some magic disappeared tomorrow, how many people believe that the Zionist apartheid state would make nice with the Palestinian people and would be the Shangri-La, the ideal place to live, a democracy that's inclusive? Zionism by nature is not inclusive. It's an exclusivist ideology. They are not going to change. So even if by some magic, like I said, they disappear, the problem is still going to be there.
Well, it has been an excuse by Israel to kill so many innocent civilians in Gaza. But what about West Bank? There is no Hamas in West Bank, and the
There
Israeli
is
settlers and the Israeli military is killing innocent civilians even there.
excellent point. Very good point. And there have been some reports in the Western media, very few, not many. But when you look at other sources, the most popular, of course, in the Middle East is Al Jazeera. When you look at other sources, what you find out is Hamas is not in the West Bank. Why is there, as you just pointed out, exactly correct? Why are the Israelis doing what they're doing in the West Bank? Why? I'll take it further. In southern Lebanon, why are they constantly trying to provoke Iran through Hezbollah, as well as the Houthi rebels down in Yemen, which, by the way, the Houthi rebels, all they're doing is trying to prevent cargo vessels from going to Israeli ports. So, in their indirect way, trying to help the Palestinians, which the rest of the Muslim world, and I'm glad you brought that up, by the way, because I want to raise an important point, because a couple of days ago this came up in the Belgian government here in Europe. You have the entire Muslim world, which has expressed outrage. Erdogan here in Turkey. You have all the Muslims. Oh, this is an outrage. The Saudis, outrage, outrage, outrage. When you look, however, as I try to do some brief research from public statistics through the World Trade Organization. When you look at trade between Muslim countries and Israel, it hasn't stopped. And actually, in some cases, with some countries, it went up, not down. Now, compare that with how the West, led by the US, reacted with sanctions, punitive sanctions against Russia. A couple of days ago, and I caught it in a Belgian uh, online media outlet, a high level, the vice premier, I believe, a high level government official in Belgium she said, enough is enough. We have seen bombs rained on Gaza. Nobody has said anything about sanctions against Israel, because as soon as you say anything about the policy of the state of Israel, you're anti Semitic. Now, I criticize the policy of Erdogan. No one calls me anti Turkish. I criticize the policy of Canada. Nobody says I'm anti Canadian. But as soon as you criticize the policy of Israel, you're anti Semitic. So she proposed that the Belgian government consider sanctions. And she is well aware that she'll be labeled anti Semitic because she proposed sanctions as a measure to stop the killing of civilians. Because, as you pointed out earlier, the UN is not doing anything. Not that they don't want to, by the way, because I used to know a couple of people who worked for the United Nations. They're very, very good people. They're very nice and intelligent people, and they mean well. It's just that they're powerless because the way it's structured, the governance structure is such that it's really a conglomerate of countries. And unless there is agreement, they're powerless. So this is very important. West Bank, what did they do? Why are they being punished? Even southern Lebanon with Gaza, Hezbollah has gone out of its way not to cause problems. Iran has been tremendously restrained. Now, have been reports, and obviously, unless we look at the official archives of the official papers of the government of Iran, which we're not going to, or China, we can't confirm this, but there have been reports that both China and to a lesser degree, I guess, Russia, have urged Iran not to take the bait of Israel, behind which is the US, the neoconservatives in Washington, D.C., advising President Biden, taking that bait. And Iran hasn't taken the bait, by the way. Now, what's happening in the Red Sea with the Houthi rebels, which, by the way, are it's not a secret, they're allied with Iran and they're supported by Iran. That is as close as we have come so far to some kind of a conflict. However, there are still signs that neither Iran nor the US want to take the bait of Israel to expand this. Because I want to make one point here about Iran, because this now gets into a web, an entangled web. If Israel can actually extricate itself from what it has done, and what it has done is very serious. This is a very serious military campaign against civilians. That's all it is. It's not a war. What it has done is it can extricate itself if some kind of a conflict breaks out. It involves both the US and Iran. And then Israel comes out smelling like a rose saying, you see, it's Iran. It was Iran all along. They're behind Hamas, Hezbollah, and the Houthis. Oh, it's this excess of evil. We're just defending ourselves. See what I'm saying? So they want to, one way for them to legitimize, which in my view, even if that were to happen, this still, in my view, is not in the best interests, forget the Muslims, forget the Palestinians, of the Israelis themselves. I just fail to see how this serves the longer term interests of the Israeli people. It is mind-boggling to me how the Israeli people can live under these conditions. I am encouraged that there are a lot of Israeli people who want a ceasefire, who want an end to this perpetual conflict, an end to apartheid. I'm encouraged by that. And I believe that the Israeli people will decide the fate more than Washington or anybody, or the Europeans or anybody else. They will come to some kind of an epiphany that it is not in their interest to live like this. You know, taking the house of a Palestinian instead of building, in the West Bank, burning down their olive trees, so you can build an apartment building. Um, this is not a conflict as a way of life is no way to live. Now there have been reports in the British press and European press, but also in the Arab press and around the world, that there are, I'm sure you know this already anyway, there is energy exploration. The British Petroleum Company is doing energy exploration in off the offshore of Gaza, and apparently that's one of the motives for this war, and that the October 7th hit, which the Israeli government knew about, because Egypt insists that they informed them, but they did nothing about it. So one dimension is that they let it happen, and this was a pretext to do the kind of ethnic cleansing that's taking place in Gaza, and then proceed with all kinds of plans for Gaza, including the fossil fuel issues. And they're talking about enormous amounts of money. Um, so there is that angle. Now, would they have done this if there were no findings, of um, fossil fuels? Well, apartheid has existed for 75 years, long before they knew about fossil fuels in the offshore Gaza area. So they probably would have. But again, I fail to see how the Israeli people's interests are best served. Honestly, I would never want to live under those conditions. I just don't understand the mindset. How would anyone live in harmony and peace under those conditions?
It's just a way of fooling the world, but the world is smart enough to know that what Israel is doing, and the world is even smart enough, just as you mentioned, that criticism of Israel is considered anti-Semitism. But the world is smart enough to know that it's not anti-Semitism. In fact, even there are some Orthodox Jews who oppose Zionism, and
Absolutely.
Zionism is not limited to Jews. Muslims can be Zionists, Christians can be Zionists, and in fact, we have seen that not only Muslims, but even Christians and Jews have also been the target of the Israeli government attacks. We have seen not only the mosques being destroyed, but even churches as well. People were taking shelter in churches and they bombed those churches with the airstrikes. So before we conclude this conversation, I would like to ask, what is the solution to this entire conflict?
Assad, I believe that the I believe in the concept of
How do you think
self-determination.
that this conflict can be resolved?
I believe that the first thing, as the United Nations has clearly stated, and 153 countries, including Pakistan and India, have stated, that the immediate thing is ceasefire, stop the killing. That's the first step. The first step is to have a ceasefire, stop the killing. The next step, as the United Nations has pointed out, is to provide humanitarian aid to Gaza. There are people, Palestinian doctors are pointing out there are people in Gaza with infectious diseases. There are people in need of medication. They don't have it. There is a huge need of humanitarian aid. So that's the second step. Step one, ceasefire. Step two, humanitarian aid. Step three is to have an international group that includes, obviously, representatives from the Palestinian side, as well, obviously, as the government of Israel, and then regional players, as well as um, the Chinese, who have a big interest, by the way. They're the largest trading partner for the Arab world. Um, the Chinese, India has to be included. Pakistan has to be included. Um, the United States, obviously, the Western Europeans are going to be included. Russia. There has to be an international group, first as a working group, and then up to the ministerial level, to the level of foreign ministers, to arrive at some kind of a permanent solution. Now, the two-state solution, going back to 1947, what the United Nations proposed back then, to this day, I hear it all the time, two-state solution, two-state solution. Bibi Netanyahu takes credit for preventing the two-state solution by helping Hamas come into fruition. What has that achieved? Obviously, the only thing it has achieved is to perpetuate the apartheid state, but at a cost to the Israelis themselves, living in this constant state of anxiety, of warfare. Warfare is a way of life. I'm borrowing that title, by the way, from a brilliant American historian, William Appleman Williams, who wrote a book during the Vietnam War. He was frustrated with the US role in the Vietnam War. And he wrote a book called Empire as a Way of Life. This is, in the case of Israel, it's war is a way of life. War is a way of life, is no way to live. You know, clearly there are tangible interests that are making money out of this. Make no mistake about it. There are people, the people of Israel and the people of Palestine are not benefiting. There are companies that are making money, and it's not just defense. There are other companies from energy and high tech that are making money out of this. But a permanent long-term solution means self-determination. And self-determination, in my view, goes right back to the two-state solution. Exactly what the UN proposed, but it went nowhere in 1947. The idea, I have heard other solutions. For example, create a secular society that's pluralistic, that includes Palestinians as equals. Honestly, in practice, in daily life, because I've lived in the United States for a long time, I just don't see that working very well. I don't see it working very well. Just as I see institutional discrimination in the United States, I think that we can expect about the same thing. And the U.S., is the Civil War has been over for 150 years, but the legacy of it is still here. So I think that separate two-state solution is one way. Now, it is regrettable to read today in the British press, among others, that former Prime Minister Tony Blair has accepted an Israeli proposal to facilitate the so-called voluntary migration, meaning ethnic cleansing, of Palestinians out of Gaza. In other words, there have been all kinds of reports that the Israelis have been looking to simply get rid of the Palestinians. But people who have studied Israeli history know that this is not a new thing. The goal of Israel was always to get rid of the Palestinians. That's why the two-state solution, in my view, is what has to take place. If China, Russia, US, India, the Muslim countries come together on this and agree to a two-state solution, and basically Israel obviously doesn't. There are few within the elite of the Israeli political class who might accept it, who will accept it, but I don't see this government is not going to accept it. And this government, I don't know how long this government is going to last. To be honest with you, um, I have no idea about its future. I don't see it lasting very long. Anyway, a two-state solution, um, fully recognized sovereign Palestinian state, and that's the solution.
Well, is there any final message that you would like to convey to the audience regarding this entire issue?
I think that as I have reflected on this for all this time that has been happening, um, it has really been disheartening for me. I have many, both Israeli and Jewish friends, as well as Palestinian and Muslim friends from different Muslim countries. It's disheartening to me to see how war brings out the worst in human nature and how people allow so easily to be carried away by propaganda to the degree that you can present video evidence of an IDF soldier, an Israeli soldier, with an automatic weapon pointed to the head of a child, a little girl, right? And you still get from very hardline Zionists the reaction, we're just defending ourselves against terrorists. It's a 7-year-old girl, who is not armed and surrounded by IDF soldiers with automatic weapons. The war brings out the ultimate absurdities in human nature. And that is very disheartening to me about what this war, as well as the other one, but the other one is much, the one in Ukraine is a conventional war. It's a different sort of war. It brings out the worst in human beings. You would think that the people who suffered through the Holocaust, and I used to have neighbors, Holocaust survivor neighbors in Chicago, um, you would think they would have empathy. They would say, what are we doing? What are we doing? Why? Why are we doing this? There's no need for this. What I mean? And so I think that the message is for people to reflect on their values.
Okay, so ladies and gentlemen, it was these were the insights and these were the opinions of Mr. John Kofus. Well, I apologize if I pronounced your name incorrectly,
No,
because
it's
there
pronounced.
are
You
some.
pronounced it. You pronounced it fine. It's fine.
Okay, because there are some difference of accents. Your accent is different of English. My accent is different.
No,
So,
that's,
well, thank you, Mr. Kofus, for your precious time and
thank
for
you. Thank you.
your opinions and the insights that you share. And I
Thank
would
you very
also like
much.
to thank all the viewers for their precious time and to listen to this conversation. So I would like to request all of you to like this video and please do share your opinions in the comment section and don't forget to share this video. Thank you for your time. Bye bye.